Granite is one of the hardest natural stones on Earth. Even today, shaping it requires diamond-tipped blades, industrial machinery, and incredible precision. So when a claim began spreading online that a 4,000-year-old Sumerian tablet said granite was never cut, people paid attention. Some said the Sumerians softened stone. Others claimed they used sound to shape it. Some even argued the knowledge had been deliberately erased from history. It's an extraordinary story. But there's one problem. We couldn't find the tablet. So instead of asking whether the claim was true, we asked a different question. Did any surviving Sumerian tablet ever say this at all? Because if such a text existed, it would completely change what archaeologists understand about one of the world's earliest civilizations. If it didn't, then an equally fascinating mystery remained. How did millions of people become convinced that it did? If you enjoy investigations where ancient mysteries are tested against real archaeological evidence, not internet rumors, subscribe to The Shadow Ancestral. Every week, we follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it overturns the story we expect it to tell. Our search began where it had to begin. Not with modern videos. Not with conspiracy theories. But with the tablets themselves. And almost immediately, we discovered something no one making these viral claims seemed to mention. They weren't talking about granite. Diorite. And that single word changed the entire investigation. If you search online for ancient construction mysteries, you'll see one word repeated over and over again. Granite. But when we turn to the actual Mesopotamian texts, that wasn't the stone we kept finding. It was diorite. At first, that might sound like a small mistake. It isn't. Because changing that single word changes the entire story. Here's what we actually know. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, had very little building stone of its own. Unlike Egypt, where massive quarries stood close to the Nile, southern Mesopotamia was built on mud, clay, and reeds. The stone was precious. Every large block had to come from somewhere else. Persian Gulf toward Magan, modern-day Oman. And one king, more than any other, left us a detailed record of that effort. His name was Gudea, ruler of the city-state of Lagash around 2125 BCE. His inscriptions don't describe discovering a lost technology. They describe something far more ambitious. Importing enormous quantities of valuable stone from distant lands to build a temple for his god. The inscriptions repeatedly celebrate diorite. Not because it was mysterious, but because it was difficult. It was dense, exceptionally hard, and incredibly expensive to obtain. Owning it wasn't just a sign of wealth. It was a statement. A king who could command diorite from across the sea was a king whose power reached far beyond his own borders. Then another question emerged. If an easier stone existed much closer to home, why would Gudea choose one of the hardest rocks on Earth? Because the deeper we looked into the tablets, the less this resembled a story about mysterious technology. And the more it became a story about something even harder to achieve. Moving mountains across the sea. And that impossible journey begins in a place the Sumerians called Magan. The Sumerians called it Magan. Today, most archaeologists identify it with parts of modern-day Oman and the United Arab Emirates. 4,000 years ago, it was famous for two things: copper and black stone. Here's what we actually know. Mesopotamian inscriptions repeatedly describe Magan as the source of the stone used for royal monuments. Archaeological excavations in Oman have uncovered ancient copper mines, massive slag heaps, and evidence of large-scale industry dating back to the same period. Even more remarkably, scientists have compared the mineral composition of Gudea statues with rock formations in Oman. The match is striking. This wasn't a legend. It was a trade network. Imagine the journey. A block weighing several tons had to be quarried in the mountains, dragged across rough ground, loaded onto wooden ships, sailed hundreds of kilometers through the Persian Gulf, stopped at Dilmun for supplies, then carried inland until it finally reached the city of Lagash. Every stage carried the risk of failure. One broken ship, one cracked block, one failed harvest delayed the workforce. Months of planning could disappear beneath the water. And yet, Gudea doesn't boast about discovering a secret way to shape the stone. He boasts that he brought it home. That detail is easy to miss. But it's one of the most revealing lines in the entire investigation. The greatest symbol of royal power wasn't hidden technology. It was the ability to organize people, trade, labor, and faith on an extraordinary scale. But bringing the stone to Mesopotamia only solved the first problem. A much harder challenge was waiting. Because once those enormous blocks arrived, someone still had to carve them. And that's where the internet begins telling a very different story. Could ancient craftsmen really shape one of the hardest stones they had ever worked, using nothing more than Bronze Age tools? Or have we underestimated them all along? Stand in front of one of Gudea's statues today, and it's easy to understand why so many extraordinary theories exist. The surface is remarkably smooth. The inscriptions are precise. The edges are crisp. And all of it was carved into one of the hardest stones the ancient Mesopotamians ever worked on. Diorite is even harder than granite in many cases. It's dense, tough, and notoriously difficult to shape. So here's the question that fuels countless internet videos. How do you carve a stone that's harder than the metal tools you supposedly used? At first, that sounds impossible. If you imagine an ancient craftsman simply hitting diorite with a copper chisel, it doesn't make much sense. Copper is softer than the stone. So where did the material go? Here's what we actually know. Ancient craftsmen weren't relying on copper alone. The real cutting work came from something much smaller. Quartz sand. Those tiny grains are harder than copper. Mixed with water and worked continuously, they acted like countless microscopic cutting edges, gradually wearing away the stone. The copper wasn't slicing through the diorite. It was carrying the abrasive. It's a slower process. A much slower process. But experimental archaeologists have demonstrated that it works. Not in minutes. Not even in days. Sometimes over weeks. That changes the question entirely. The mystery isn't whether it was possible. It clearly was. The mystery is how much patience, skill, and labor it demanded. Imagine spending months carving a single mistake-free inscription into stone this unforgiving. One slip, and an entire monument could be ruined. No wonder kings celebrated these statues. They weren't displaying magic. They were displaying mastery. But if archaeology has a workable explanation, why do millions of people still believe something completely different? That answer has almost nothing to do with Mesopotamia. To find the origin of the mystery, we had to leave Sumer behind altogether. By now, the evidence seemed straightforward. The tablets described imported stone, skilled craftsmen, long-distance trade, years of labor. Nothing about melting rock. Nothing about mysterious vibrations. Nothing about stones becoming soft. So we asked a different question. If the Sumerians never said these things, who did? The answer surprised us. Most of these ideas didn't begin with Sumer at all. Many can be traced to stories about the Egyptian pyramids. Others emerged centuries later in medieval legends. Some didn't appear until the 20th century. And a surprising number exploded only after the internet made them profitable. One of the oldest stories comes from the 10th century Arab historian al-Masudi. He recorded a legend claiming that enormous stones could be moved using mysterious rods and strange sounds. Whether he believed the story himself is another question. But one thing is certain. He wasn't describing the Sumerians. He wasn't quoting a cuneiform tablet. And he wasn't writing 4,000 years ago. He was recording a legend nearly 3,000 years after Gudea's lifetime. Centuries later, another story captured the public imagination. Edward Leedskalnin, the builder of Coral Castle, hinted that he had rediscovered the secrets of the ancient builders. He never demonstrated such a technology. Yet the mystery became part of popular culture. Books repeated it. Television amplified it. The internet transformed it. And somewhere along the way, Egyptian legends, modern speculation, and genuine Mesopotamian history were blended into a single story. That's how myths often grow. Not from one enormous lie, but from dozens of small misunderstandings layered on top of one another. Granite instead of diorite. Egypt instead of Sumer. Legend instead of inscription. Until the original story becomes almost impossible to recognize. Which brings us back to the question that started this investigation. If the tablets never claimed any secret stone technology, what did they actually want future generations to remember? Because their answer is far more revealing than any internet theory. The kings weren't trying to impress us with impossible technology. They were trying to impress us with something else entirely. By this point, one conclusion had become unavoidable. No surviving Sumerian tablet says granite was never cut. No royal inscription describes softened stone. No construction text records mysterious vibrations or forgotten machines. So what do the tablets celebrate? Here's what we actually know. Again and again, the inscriptions return to the same ideas. Not impossible technology, but extraordinary effort. Gudea proudly records bringing precious stones from distant mountains. He describes gathering cedar from Lebanon, metals from foreign lands, and skilled craftsmen from across his kingdom. Every sentence points toward the same achievement. Organization. Think about what that requires. Ships crossing the Persian Gulf. Caravans moving through harsh terrain. Quarry workers. Sailors. Stone masons. Metalworkers. Scribes. Priests. Administrators. Thousands of people spread across hundreds of kilometers, working toward a single goal. That's what Gudea wanted to remember. Not a miracle. A civilization capable of coordinating the impossible. Ironically, modern myths may have hidden something even more remarkable. When we imagine ancient people using secret technologies, we sometimes overlook what they actually accomplished. Without engines. Without steel. Without electricity. They built trade networks stretching across seas. They organized massive construction projects. And they produced monuments that still stand, or survive in museums, over 4,000 years later. The more we searched for hidden machines, the more we found evidence of something else. Human ingenuity, patient craftsmanship, relentless planning. Those qualities may not sound as sensational as lost technology, but they're supported by the evidence. And in many ways, they're even more extraordinary. The internet promised a forgotten machine. The tablets preserved something far more valuable. A record of what determined people could achieve together. Narrator, quietly. Which leaves just one final question. If the greatest mystery was never hidden inside the stone, where was it hiding all along? When we began this investigation, we were looking for a tablet. One that supposedly claimed granite was never cut. After searching through the evidence, we discovered something unexpected. That tablet doesn't exist. Not in the surviving Sumerian texts. Not in the royal inscriptions. Not in the Gudea cylinders. Not anywhere modern Assyriologists have identified. And yet, millions of people believe it does. How? Because history doesn't only survive through ancient inscriptions. It also survives through modern storytelling. Sometimes those stories preserve the truth. Sometimes they quietly replaced it. A translation becomes simplified. A difficult stone becomes granite. A legend from another civilization is attached to Mesopotamia. A headline becomes more dramatic. A video repeats the claim. Then another. And before long, the copy becomes more famous than the original. The myth becomes easier to find than the evidence. But none of this makes the real story less remarkable. If anything, it makes it even more extraordinary. More than 4,000 years ago, people without engines, without steel, without electricity, organized one of the ancient world's most ambitious construction projects. They crossed seas. They established trade routes stretching hundreds of kilometers. They imported one of the hardest stones available to them. Then, through patience, skill, and relentless craftsmanship, they transformed it into monuments that have survived longer than the kingdoms that built them. Perhaps that's why Gudea chose diorite in the first place. Not because it was impossible to carve, but because everyone who saw it would understand exactly how difficult it had been. The stone itself became the message. Not a mystery. Not magic. Endurance. The greatest technology the Sumerians left behind wasn't a machine. It was a civilization capable of planning, cooperating, and believing in a project so deeply that thousands of people contributed to something none of them would finish alone. That's a technology every civilization still depends on. If this investigation changed the way you think about ancient history, I'd love to hear your perspective. What surprised you more? That the tablets never mentioned granite, or that the real story turned out to be even more impressive than the myth? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and many of your questions inspire future investigations. If you enjoy evidence-based explorations of ancient history, where we follow the sources instead of the headlines, subscribe to the Shadow Ancestral. There are thousands of ancient claims still waiting to be tested. Some mysteries disappear when you uncover the truth. The best ones become even deeper.